Next we have W.E.B. Du Bois. I know it looks like Dubois, but it's not. It's actually correctly Du Bois. He lived 1869 to 1963. He was American. He had sort of a unique situation when he was growing up for an African American of the time in the United States. He lived in a small European community in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, where he attended an integrated school, had white playmates. Really, segregation and racial issues sort of didn't occur in this small city where Du Bois grows up. So he's sort of insulated from all of these types of things. He never really experiences a lot of racism as a child, and so that sort of, I think, develops his way of thinking kind of in an interesting way. The community was highly, highly tolerant of minorities. They go to school together, they all went to church together. So this kind of shapes his opinions on the subject of racism early on. His neighborhood church raises money and donates money for him to go to college. He's incredibly academically gifted. He goes to Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, and just picture the stark contrast from this really insulated small community in Massachusetts to this university in Tennessee. And he goes there and just experiences the full brunt of Southern racism. He witnesses lynchings, he experiences the Jim Crow laws, and on and on and on. And this really changes the way that he thinks about racism and race relations in the United States. So he graduates from Fisk, and then he goes to Harvard University. So like I said, incredibly academically gifted, but they wouldn't accept his transfer credits from Fisk University. Some of you might have experience with this if you've ever tried to transfer credits. So he actually goes and gets a second degree from Harvard, where he graduates with honors. Due to his performance as an undergrad, he receives a scholarship to attend graduate school at Harvard. So he's on scholarship now, not paying for his school anymore. As part of his studies, he receives a fellowship to go to Berlin and do some research work. So he travels to Berlin for a couple of years and travels extensively throughout Europe while he's there. So now just picture his mentality and his experiences. Grows up in this really insulated, integrated community, then goes and experiences full force of Southern racism in Nashville, Tennessee, then goes to Harvard, then goes to Berlin and spends a couple of years traveling throughout Europe. Imagine how rare it was for an African American man to have that experience and knowledge at that time. He ends up graduating from Harvard with his PhD in 1895. He becomes the first ever Black man to earn a PhD from Harvard University. This is really, really important and really shapes, I think, the trajectory of his life. That accomplishment, just on its own, would have been enough to land him in the history books. But sort of, he says, that's not enough for me. That's great, then that's fine. This academic degree is fantastic, and Harvard has been incredible. But he feels sort of this responsibility to take that and do more, which is kind of rare. Any other Black man could have just taken his PhD, worked as a professor, kind of kept his mouth shut and stayed under the radar and earned a really good living for the rest of his life. But Du Bois does not do that. He uses his degree to speak out extensively for the remainder of his life about race relations in the U.S. So right after he graduates, he accepts a one-year research position at the University of Philadelphia, where he performs sociological field research and publishes a study called the Philadelphia Negro. And it's the first case study of a Black community in the United States. He publishes this in 1899. He literally went door to door in Black communities and interviewed people, asked them questions, compiled statistics, really wanted to find out what life was like for the average Black person in Philadelphia. This is a huge landmark in the scientific discipline of sociology because it was really the first academic case study that had ever been done. He also, as part of this, sort of lays the groundwork for how to visually represent data in a study. And you can find this study online and look at it, and you can see he has charts with statistics and things like that in there. This is like common knowledge for us now, and almost any academic article that you will read will have graph and stats and data in there. But Du Bois basically lays the groundwork, and he's the first person to ever figure out how to sort of compile statistics and visually represent them in a way that's easy to digest. So it's the first ever case study really done in sociology. And really the first visual representation of statistics in a scientific article in sociology. And every article from then on basically models, after Du Bois, the Philadelphia Negro. He taught at Atlanta University in history and economics. He writes in 1903, The Souls of Black Folk, and he attempts to demonstrate the genius and sort of humanity of the Black race, and talks a lot about the double consciousness that the Black in America have at the time, this idea that they are both American and Black, but their American consciousness is sort of this idea that they're not welcome in their own country, and the whites of America really don't have a place for them in the society that they've created and the nation that they've created. So they really struggle with being Black in America and being both American and Black, and struggling with the conflict between those two sort of identities in their lives. So he writes about that. Sort of the soul of Black folks, one of the things that he tries to accomplish is he publishes art and literature and poems from the Black community, basically proving that a lot of the white art, fables and poems and literature that sort of the whites take credit for and some of them become famous for originated in the Black communities. Sometimes they're even copied word for word. And so he really tries to demonstrate people with this work how a lot of things that the whites think that they sort of invented or wrote first really wasn't the case at all, and really try to demonstrate that there are incredibly intelligent and talented Black artists. He too was one of the founders of the NAACP with Jane Addams, and he establishes its magazine or newsletter. It was called The Crisis. It's first published in 1910. 10 years later, it had a nationwide readership of 100,000 people. The topics ranged from Black culture to lynchings to interracial marriage to women's rights. And Du Bois actually, in addition to being its editor, writes a large part of the content for the editor for quite a long time. So he's writing the articles and doing the editing and on until other people sort of get involved and take some of the workload. Every year for 19 years, Du Bois published a book on the relations between Blacks and whites in America and how things have evolved or not evolved, maybe setbacks that were experienced, things like that, every year for almost 20 years. I can't stress enough how just the volume of writing that Du Bois did in his life. I sometimes think that he must have had, teams of writers somewhere locked in a room that were just pumping out content, because just the sheer volume of things that he wrote is just incredible. He becomes incredibly well known as a result of being the first Black man to get his PhD from Harvard, and he gets invited to do lectures across the world. And he doesn't hold back. He's honest, and he goes to other countries and lectures on what it's like to be a Black man in America and what race relationships are like in America at the time. As you can imagine, full well they're not good. And he doesn't lie. He doesn't try to sugarcoat anything. He gives honest depictions and honest accounts of what it's like in the U.S. at the time. The government has a problem with this, as you might imagine. They don't like the idea of this incredibly intelligent Black man going around the world and essentially sort of dragging America through the mud. So they just kind of get creative and find ways to try to censor him a little bit. During the era of McCarthyism in the 1950s, the government compiles this file on Du Bois, and in 1951, he has to go to trial. They try to convict him due to his involvement in this organization called the Peace Information Center. And it was a pacifist organization focused on banning nuclear weapons worldwide. And that's literally all that it was. But the government tries to use this to convict him of being a traitor. If you know anything about McCarthyism, this was the period when they went out and tried to convict people of communism. And so actors and academics and regular citizens would go before this committee and they would get tried, whether they were card-carrying communists or just sympathetic to communist countries. In DuBois' situation, it's merely because he's a member of this organization, this peaceful organization. He actually ends up winning. You can imagine he has incredible connections throughout the NAACP and throughout the community. And so he has incredibly talented attorneys that represent him. So he doesn't get convicted, but the government withdraws his passport. And so they effectively ban him from traveling internationally, which was probably their goal in the first place, so that he would stop going out and sort of bad-mouthing the U.S., even though he was being completely truthful the whole time. They revoke his passport for a period of 8 years, so he's not allowed to travel for that period of time. Eventually, he kind of gets fed up with the U.S., and he's committed his entire life to sort of trying to improve race relations and writing extensively about what it's like to be Black in America. And the president of Ghana invites him to come to Ghana and work on a huge, huge project that's the encyclopedia of the movement from blacks from Africa throughout the globe. And he finally accepts. He says, fine, there's no progress being made in the U.S. The U.S. government is hugely unappreciative of my efforts. They revoked my passport, so I couldn't travel for a period of my life. So he moves to Ghana. Him and his family move, and he works on this project, and he actually ends up dying there in 1963. It pains me every time I think about him dying in 1963 because, as you may or may not know, the very next year in 1964, the Civil Rights Act is passed in the U.S. As a result of a long effort to sort of improve equality in the country. And the civil rights movement owes a huge, huge, really like unexplainable debt to Du Bois for just his life's work of writing about being Black in America and the race relations in America. And in fact, a large portion of the text of the Civil Rights Act is actually words that Du Bois had written in the past. So the Civil Rights Act would look much, much different if Du Bois hadn't lived and hadn't written what he did. So it always pains me a little bit to think about the fact that he never saw the Civil Rights Act get put into action and passed. He died the year before that happened. So huge contributions to American society and civil rights. And really his story is a story of the first Black man to get a PhD from Harvard and then willing to dedicate his life and use those credentials to try to make things better in the United States. Really interesting person and a lot of contributions to sociology and philosophy and social structure and race relations and that type of thing.